I stood in the middle of my own restaurant, the Heritage, wearing a server's uniform that felt like a costume on my skin, balancing a tray of champagne flutes while the Ashford family's eyes burned holes into me. It was Miles's big night. My brother-in-law had just been named senior partner at some fancy financial firm, and they'd chosen my place in Brooklyn to throw the party. Not because they respected me, but because it was convenient, and they assumed I'd give them a deal. I wasn't even supposed to be serving tonight, but Noah, my manager, called me an hour ago, voice tight, saying we were short-staffed. So here I was, Callan Ward, the guy who built this place from nothing, passing out drinks to people who looked at me like I was dirt on their shoes. The air smelled of roasted garlic and rosemary from the kitchen, but it couldn't mask the sourness of their whispers. "That's Clarissa's husband?" The waiter, one of her cousins, muttered, loud enough for me to hear as I set a glass down. My wife was across the room, her dark hair swept up, laughing with her parents, Dorian and Miriam, like she didn't notice the way they were slicing me apart with their eyes. I wanted to believe she was just distracted, caught up in the moment, but deep down, I knew better. She'd been pulling away for months, maybe years, ever since I left my old life behind. I adjusted the tray, careful not to let the glasses wobble, and moved through the crowd, my shoes clicking softly on the polished wood floor. This restaurant was my dream, every inch of it. Those reclaimed oak tables, the brass light fixtures, the open kitchen where you could hear the sizzle of steaks on the grill. I'd poured everything into it, but to them, it was just a building where I played cook. Miles was the star tonight, all slick hair and tailored suit, shaking hands with clients who probably made more in a month than I'd see in a year. He caught my eye as I passed, his smirk sharp enough to cut glass, and said, "Hey, keep those drinks coming, yeah?" I nodded, jaw tight, because what else could I do? Call him out in front of everyone? Tell him I'd paid for half the liquor he was guzzling? No, I wasn't here to make a scene. I was here to help, to make sure the night went smooth, even if it meant swallowing their insults like bitter wine. The truth was, I didn't mind pitching in. I'd bust tables and wash dishes when we first opened, back when it was just me, Jonas, and Priya against the world. Those days taught me more than any corner office ever could. But tonight wasn't about nostalgia, it was about surviving a room full of people who thought I'd failed at life. Dorian, with his silver hair and permanent scowl, leaned over to Miriam and muttered something that made her lips purse. I didn't need to hear it to know what they were saying. They'd never hidden their disappointment in me, not since the day I married their daughter and refused to play by their rules. To them, success meant titles and bank accounts, not a guy in an apron who cared about perfecting a beurre blanc sauce. I glanced at Clarissa again, hoping for a look, a nod, anything to show she was still on my side, but she was deep in conversation with some guy in a blazer, her smile bright and practiced, the kind she used to save for me. I set the tray down on a side table and flexed my hands, trying to shake off the weight in my chest. Part of me wanted to walk out, let them handle their own damn party, but I couldn't do that to Noah or the staff. They were family, the kind that didn't judge you for chasing what mattered. I scanned the room, taking in the laughter, the clinking glasses, the way everyone seemed to belong except me. It wasn't just that they saw me as a waiter, it was that they saw me as nothing at all. A guy who'd thrown away a real career to mess around with pots and pans. Even my wife, who used to lie awake with me talking about our dreams, had started echoing their words lately, asking why I couldn't just go back to finance, be someone they could brag about. I picked up a new tray, this one loaded with canapes, tiny bites of smoked salmon, and dill I'd helped prep that morning, and started another lap. The chatter grew louder, a mix of congratulations for Miles and gossip about people I didn't know. I caught snippets as I moved. "He's taking the firm to new heights, such a catch. Can you believe she settled for that?" That last one stung, and I knew it was about me. I kept my head down, focusing on the rhythm of placing plates, clearing empties, anything to stay grounded. But every step felt heavier, like I was carrying more than just food. I built this place to prove something, not to them but to myself, and yet here I was, letting their words crawl under my skin. Then I heard it, clear as a bell, Miriam's voice, sharp and dripping with disgust. "It's embarrassing, really. My daughter deserves better than a man who serves for a living." I froze, my hand halfway to a table, the tray wobbling just enough to make the glasses clink. A few heads turned, but not hers. She was staring at Dorian, her face flushed from wine and anger, and he nodded like she'd just said the sky was blue. I waited for Clarissa to say something, anything, to shut it down, but she just stood there, her eyes flicking to the floor. My throat tightened, and for a second, I thought about dropping the tray and walking away, not just from the party, but from all of it. The marriage, the family, the constant fight to be seen. But I didn't. I straightened up, steadied the glasses, and kept moving, because that's what I'd always done. Kept going, even when it hurt. By the time I made it back to the kitchen, my shirt was sticking to my back, and not just from the heat. Noah was there, barking orders to the line cooks, but he paused when he saw me. "You good, boss?" he asked, his voice low enough that no one else heard. I forced a smile, because what could I say? That I was falling apart in my own restaurant? That the people I loved most thought I was a disgrace? "Yeah, just keeping the machine running," I said, setting the tray down. He didn't push, just clapped me on the shoulder and went back to work. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the chaos of sizzling pans and shouted orders, and told myself I could get through this. One night, one party, one more round of their poison. I didn't know then that everything was about to change, that in just a few hours, their smug little world would crack open. All I knew was that I was still standing, still here, and that had to count for something. I stood at the edge of the party, wiping down a table that didn't need cleaning, just to have something to do with my hands while the Ashfords tore me apart without saying a word. The heritage was alive tonight, the dining room glowing under soft lights, filled with the hum of conversation and the clink of silverware. But I felt like a ghost in my own place. Miles was holding court near the bar, his laugh loud and practiced, surrounded by people in suits who nodded like he was preaching gospel. My wife was there too, her hand resting on his arm, her smile sharp and perfect, the kind that used to make my heart race but now just left me hollow. I'd heard it all before, their whispers, their jabs, the way they looked at me like I was a stain on their family name. To them, I wasn't Callan Ward, the guy who'd built a restaurant from nothing. I was the man who'd walked away from a real career, the one who'd traded a corner office for a chef's coat and a dream they couldn't understand. A glorified food handler. Miles had called me once, right to my face, and the memory still burned, especially tonight, when I was playing server just to keep things running. I moved to clear some empty plates, my fingers brushing against the smooth ceramic, and caught a glimpse of Dorian and Miriam at their table, their heads bent together, talking low. They didn't need to raise their voices for me to know what they were saying. It was the same script they'd been reading from since I married their daughter: disappointment, judgment, that cold certainty that I'd never measure up. I used to think I could change their minds, that if I worked hard enough, built something solid, they'd see me for more than the guy who didn't fit their mold. But years of trying had taught me better. They didn't care about the late nights I'd spent scrubbing floors or the loans I'd taken to keep this place alive. To them, success was a title on a business card, not the smell of fresh bread baking at dawn. I glanced at my wife again, hoping for a flicker of something pride, maybe, or even just a look that said she still believed in me. But she was laughing at something Miles said, her eyes bright, and I felt like I was watching her from the other side of a wall. The truth was, I'd never been enough for the Ashfords, not since the day I showed up in a second-hand suit to ask for Clarissa's hand. Back then, I was still in finance, pulling six figures and wearing the right kind of watch, but even that hadn't impressed them. They wanted someone with a pedigree, someone who'd gone to the same schools as Miles, who knew the right people and played the right games. I thought marrying her would prove I belonged, but it only made things worse. Once I left my job to start the heritage, it was like I'd signed my own exile papers. "Why can't you just be practical?" she'd asked me more than once, her voice sharp with frustration. "Why do you have to do everything the hard way?" I didn't know how to explain that this place wasn't just a job. It was who I was. Every menu, every table, every damn light bulb in here was a piece of me, and I'd thought she understood that once. I carried a stack of plates to the kitchen, the noise of the party fading behind me as I pushed through the swinging doors. The air back here was warm, thick with the smell of garlic and thyme, and for a second, I could breathe again. Noah was at the grill, flipping steaks with a focus that always calmed me down. "You holding up out there?" he asked without looking up, his voice cutting through the sizzle. I set the plates by the sink and shrugged, because what could I say? That my own family thought I was a failure? That my wife was starting to agree with them? "Just another night," I said, grabbing a towel to wipe my hands. He didn't push, just nodded and went back to work, and I was grateful for it. Out there, I was a punching bag, but in here, I was still the guy who called the shots. Back in the dining room, the party was picking up, the crowd thicker now, everyone toasting Miles like he'd invented money itself. I grabbed a pitcher of water and started refilling glasses, moving quietly so I wouldn't draw attention. But it didn't matter, they saw me anyway. One of Clarissa's aunts leaned over to her friend, her voice low but not low enough. It's such a shame, isn't it? She could have done so much better. I kept my eyes on the picture, my grip tight, pretending I hadn't heard. I'd learned a long time ago to let their words slide off me. But tonight, they stuck, each one like a splinter I couldn't pull out. I wanted to tell them they were wrong, that this restaurant wasn't just some hobby I'd stumbled into. I'd planned it for years, saved every penny, studied every chef I could find, because I wanted to create something that lasted, something that wasn't just numbers on a screen. But they wouldn't care. To them, I'd always be the guy who threw it all away. I finished the water rounds and stepped back, leaning against the wall for a moment to catch my breath. My wife was still with Miles, her hand on his shoulder now, and I wondered when she'd stopped looking for me in a room. She used to come by the restaurant after work, back when it was just a hole in the wall with no sign out front, and we'd sit on crates in the alley, dreaming about what it could be. Now, she only came when there was a reason, like tonight, and even then, it was like I was invisible. Just dress normal, she'd told me before the party, her voice tight. They'll ask why you're not doing anything with your life if you wear that coat. She meant my chef's coat, the one I'd earned through years of burns and blisters. I'd laughed it off, thinking she was just nervous, but now, watching her blend so easily into their world, I wasn't so sure. I pushed off the wall and grabbed a tray of appetizers, forcing myself to keep moving. The night wasn't over, and I wasn't going to let them see me break. I'd built this place to be more than a restaurant. It was a promise to myself that I didn't need their approval to matter. But as I wove through the crowd, their eyes on me like knives, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing something more than their respect. My wife's laughter rang out again, and for the first time, it didn't sound like home. I told myself it was just the stress, the long hours, the weight of their judgment pressing down on me. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I was starting to wonder if the woman I loved still loved the man I'd become, or if she'd already traded me in for their version of who I should be. I stood behind the bar at the Heritage, polishing glasses that were already spotless, just to keep my hands busy while the party roared on without me. The dining room was a sea of suits and sparkling dresses, everyone toasting Miles like he'd hung the moon, and I was just the guy making sure their glasses stayed full. My wife was out there somewhere, probably smiling at another one of her brother's stories, and I tried not to think about how she hadn't looked my way all night. Instead, I let my mind drift back to 6 years ago, when I walked away from a life that looked good on paper but felt like a cage. I'd been pulling $140,000 a year in finance, crunching numbers in a midtown office, wearing suits that cost more than my rent. It was the kind of job the Ashfords respected, the kind that made my wife's parents nod approvingly when we got engaged. But every morning, I'd wake up with a knot in my chest, knowing I was living someone else's idea of success. So I left it all behind, quit the job, sold the fancy watch, and bet everything on a dream that felt bigger than me. It started with Jonas and Priya, my best friends since college, the only people who didn't think I was crazy when I said I wanted to open a restaurant. We'd sit up late, sketching ideas on napkins, talking about food like it was art. Jonas was the numbers guy, always crunching budgets in his head, while Priya had a knack for flavors, mixing spices like a painter with a palette. Me? I was the glue, the one who believed we could actually pull it off. We found a rundown spot in Brooklyn, a brick box with busted windows and a leaky roof, and we poured everything into it, our savings, our sleep, our sanity. The first year was brutal. I bussed tables, scrubbed floors, and washed dishes until my hands cracked, not because I had to, but because I wanted to understand every piece of this world I was building. I'd sneak into Michelin-starred kitchens on my days off, watching chefs move like dancers, learning how to plate a dish so it told a story. Those nights, I'd come home smelling like grease and possibility, and I'd lie awake, dreaming of the day the Heritage would be more than just a gamble. I set the glass down and grabbed another, my reflection flickering in the polished surface. Back then, my wife used to believe in me. She'd sit with me in that empty dining room, her shoes off, laughing about how we'd serve burgers to presidents someday. She knew what it cost me to walk away from finance, the long hours, the debt, the looks from her family that said I'd lost my mind. But she'd hold my hand and tell me it was worth it, that we were building something real. Somewhere along the way, though, that version of her faded. Now, she flinched when I talked about the restaurant, like it was a phase I should have outgrown. You could still go back, she'd say, her voice soft but pointed. There's no shame in a steady paycheck. I didn't know how to tell her that going back would be like cutting out a piece of myself. This place wasn't just a job, it was the only thing that made me feel alive. I glanced out at the party, catching sight of Miles's smug grin as he clinked glasses with some guy in a Rolex. The Ashfords thought he was the golden child, the one who'd made it, while I was the fool who'd thrown it all away. They didn't know about the nights I'd spent sleeping on a cot in the office, or the time Jonas and I had to beg the bank for an extension on our loan. They didn't know about the first time we got a good review, how Priya cried reading it because it meant we weren't just dreamers anymore. To them, I was a guy who'd traded a future for a hobby, and no amount of explaining would change that. I wondered what they'd say if they knew how close we'd come to losing everything, or how it felt to walk into this place every morning and see my name on the sign. Probably nothing. They'd just shake their heads and call it a waste. I moved to the sink, rinsing a few stray glasses, the cold water snapping me back to the present. The party was in full swing now, the air thick with perfume and ambition, and I was still on the outside looking in. I didn't mind helping out tonight, no one needed me, and I'd never been too proud to get my hands dirty. But every time I caught one of their glances, it was like a reminder that I didn't belong in their world. My wife's parents were at their table, Dorian's arm around Miriam's chair, both of them watching Miles like he was their legacy. I used to think I could win them over, that if I worked hard enough, they'd see what I was building here. But after years of their cold shoulders and backhanded comments, I'd started to wonder if it was even worth trying. They wanted a son-in-law who fit their blueprint, and I'd burned that blueprint to the ground the day I walked out of my old life. I dried my hands and stepped back into the dining room, grabbing a tray of appetizers to pass around. The crowd parted for me, but not out of respect. It was like I was invisible, just a guy with a tray they didn't need to acknowledge. I kept my head up, my smile polite, even as their voices carried over the music. He used to be something, didn't he? One of her cousins said, not bothering to lower her voice. Such a shame. I kept moving, focusing on the weight of the tray, the rhythm of my steps, anything to drown out the sting. I'd heard worse over the years, but tonight, it felt heavier, maybe because my wife wasn't there to soften it. She used to defend me, back when we were a team, but now she just stood by, letting their words land like punches I was supposed to take. I set the tray down and leaned against a pillar, stealing a moment to breathe. The restaurant was beautiful tonight, every detail exactly how I'd imagined it, the warm glow of the lights, the hum of a place that felt alive. I'd built this with my own hands, with Jonas and Priya by my side, and no one could take that away from me. But as I watched my wife laugh with her family, her back to me like I wasn't even here, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing something else. I'd walked away from one life to build this one, but what if the cost was her? What if the dream I'd fought for was the thing pushing her away? I told myself it was just the night talking, the weight of their judgment clouding my head. But deep down, I wasn't sure. All I knew was that I'd keep going, because this place, this life, was the only thing I had left that still felt like mine. I leaned against the kitchen counter at the Heritage, the noise of Miles's promotion party seeping through the swinging doors, a dull roar of laughter and clinking glasses that felt a world away. My hands were still damp from rinsing plates, and the air smelled of seared meat and fresh herbs, grounding me in a way the dining room never could. Out there, I was a prop in the Ashford family show, a man they barely acknowledged unless it was to point out what I wasn't. In here, I was home, surrounded by the chaos of sizzling pans and Noah's shouted orders, a place where I didn't have to prove anything to anyone. But even in the kitchen, I couldn't escape the weight of their judgment, the way it clung to me like grease I couldn't scrub off. My wife's family had never hidden how they felt about me, not since the day I walked into their lives, and tonight was just another page in a book they'd been writing for years. To them, I was the guy who didn't belong, the one who'd married their daughter and then had the nerve to choose a life they couldn't brag about. It wasn't always like this, or at least I told myself it wasn't. When I first met her parents, Dorian and Miriam, I was still in finance, wearing the right suits and saying the right things. But even then, I could feel their eyes sizing me up. They'd ask about my job, my plans, my connections, like I was auditioning for a role I hadn't signed up for. I thought marrying her would change things, that they'd see I loved her enough to build a life we both wanted. But love wasn't enough for them. It never had been. They wanted degrees framed on walls, titles that rolled off the tongue, invitations to the kind of parties where people checked your watch before they shook your hand. I didn't fit that mold, and once I left my job to start the Heritage, I might as well have painted a target on my back. A restaurant. Miriam had said once, her voice dripping with pity. That's quaint. I'd laughed it off, but the word stuck, a reminder that nothing I did would ever measure up. I grabbed a towel and wiped down the counter, more out of habit than necessity, my mind replaying the years I'd spent trying to crack their code. I'd sent gifts, bottles of wine for Dorian's birthday, flowers for Miriam, even a weekend getaway for their anniversary, all paid for out of my own pocket. I'd fixed leaks in their old house, driven across town to jumpstart their car, offered to host dinners at the restaurant just to give them a night off. Every time, I'd hoped it would shift something, that they'd see I wasn't just some guy who'd stumbled into their daughter's life. But the gifts went unmentioned, the favors forgotten, and the dinner invites brushed off with excuses about how they preferred something more formal. My wife used to smooth it over, her hand on mine, whispering that they'd come around. "They're just set in their ways," she'd say, her smile warm enough to make me believe it. But somewhere along the line, she stopped defending me and started echoing them instead, her words sharp and impatient. "Maybe if you didn't insist on doing things your way, they'd respect you more," she'd said last month, her eyes avoiding mine. I didn't know how to tell her that my way was the only thing keeping me sane. I glanced at the kitchen clock, still an hour before the party would wind down. I could hear Miles's voice through the doors, loud and smug, probably telling another story about how he'd closed some big deal. The Ashfords ate it up, their golden boy who'd checked every box they'd ever drawn. I wondered what it was like to live in a world where approval came so easy, where your worth wasn't questioned every time you walked into a room. I tried to play their game once, back when I was still in finance, sitting through dinners where they'd grill me about my career like it was a deposition. Even then, I'd felt like an outsider, my answers never quite good enough, my job never quite prestigious enough. Leaving that world was the best decision I'd ever made, but it came with a cost I hadn't seen coming, a family that treated me like I'd failed, and a wife who was starting to agree with them. I pushed off the counter and checked the dessert trays, making sure everything was ready for the next round. My wife had begged me not to host family events here, saying it made things awkward when I was working instead of mingling. But tonight wasn't my choice. Miles had picked the Heritage because it was trendy, because his clients would be impressed by the exposed brick and the craft cocktails. He hadn't asked me, just sent an email to Noah assuming I'd comp half the bill. I didn't, and I wouldn't, but I still felt the sting of being used, of knowing they only showed up here when it served their image. I wondered what they'd say if they knew how much this place meant to me, how every table, every recipe, every light in the ceiling was a piece of a dream I'd fought for. Probably nothing. They'd just roll their eyes and change the subject, like they always did when I talked about my work. I carried a tray of pastries back to the dining room, the noise hitting me like a wave as I stepped through the doors. My wife was at her parents' table now, her dress catching the light, her laugh bright and effortless. For a second, I could see the woman I'd fallen for, the one who'd believed in me when this restaurant was just a sketch on a napkin. But then she glanced my way, and her smile faltered, like she was embarrassed to see me holding a tray. I kept moving, setting plates down with a nod, ignoring the way her mother's eyes flicked over me like I was part of the decor. "Everything okay?" I asked, more out of habit than hope, and Miriam gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Fine, thank you," she said, her tone clipped, and I knew better than a push. I'd spent years trying to win them over, but it was like shouting into a void. Nothing came back. As I made my way back to the kitchen, I felt the familiar ache in my chest, the one that came from hoping for something I'd never get. I'd built this life to be free of their rules, to create something that mattered on my terms. But standing here, surrounded by their judgment, I couldn't help wondering if I'd made a mistake, not in choosing the Heritage, but in thinking I could keep my wife by my side while I did it. She used to be my partner, my home, but now she felt like a stranger wearing her face. I told myself it was just tonight, just the pressure of their world pressing down on us. But deep down, I wasn't sure anymore. All I knew was that I couldn't go back, couldn't be the man they wanted, because that man wasn't me. I'd keep fighting for this place, for myself, even if it meant fighting alone. I stood in the middle of the Heritage's dining room, my server's uniform sticking to my skin, holding a tray of empty glasses while the Ashford's party spun around me like a storm I couldn't escape. The air was thick with the smell of roasted lamb and red wine, but all I could focus on was the knot in my stomach, the kind that comes from knowing you're a stranger in your own house. Miles was at the center of it all, his promotion to senior partner the excuse for this whole show, shaking hands and laughing too loud, while my wife stood nearby, her eyes anywhere but on me. I wasn't supposed to be working tonight, Noah had it covered, but when he called about the staffing shortage, I pulled on the black shirt and stepped in, thinking I could help without making waves. Now, I was drowning in their stares, their whispers cutting sharper than any knife in my kitchen. I'd built this place from nothing, turned it into one of Brooklyn's best, but to them, I was just the help, a man who'd traded a future for a tray and a dream they'd never understand. I moved through the crowd, clearing plates and refilling water, my hands steady even as my chest tightened. My wife's parents, Dorian and Miriam, were at their usual table, their faces set in that familiar mix of boredom and disdain. I'd caught their comments all night, little jabs about my job, my choices, the way they said restaurant, like it was a dirty word. I learned to let it roll off me, but tonight, it was piling up, each word a brick in a wall I couldn't climb. My wife wasn't helping, she hadn't said a word to me since we got here, just gave me that look when I showed up in the uniform, the one that said I'd embarrassed her again. I wanted to grab her hand, pull her aside, ask when we'd stop being a team, but she was too busy playing the perfect daughter, the perfect sister, to notice me falling apart. I was halfway across the room when it happened. A sharp cry cut through the chatter, and I turned to see one of the new servers, a kid named Sam, frozen in place, a bottle of red wine slipping from his hands. It hit the floor with a crack, splashing across Miriam's cream-colored dress like blood on snow. The room went quiet for a split second, everyone staring as she stood up, her face twisted in fury. "You clumsy idiot," she snapped, her voice loud enough to make heads turn. Sam stammered an apology, his face red, but she wasn't listening. She was already rounding on Noah, who was rushing over with a towel. "Is this how you run a place?" she demanded. "Where's the manager? I want to speak to someone in charge." I set my tray down and stepped forward, my heart pounding, knowing I couldn't let Sam take the fall. "I'm here," I said, keeping my voice calm. "I'll take care of it." The air shifted when they realized it was me. Miriam's eyes narrowed, her lips curling like she'd tasted something sour. Dorian stood up beside her, his jaw tight, and I could feel the whole room watching, waiting for the show. "You?" she said, her voice dripping with disbelief. "You're handling this?" I nodded, grabbing a clean towel from a nearby table and offering it to her, but she swatted it away. "This is what you've become?" Miles cut in, his laugh sharp and mean, stepping closer like he was about to take a swing. "A waiter in your own house? That's rich." I felt the heat rise in my face, but I kept my eyes on him, refusing to flinch. "I'm just helping out," I said, my voice steady even as my hands shook. "Let's get you cleaned up, Miriam. We've got spare linens in the back." She didn't move, just stared at me like I was something she'd scraped off her shoe. "How shameful," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "My daughter married down, and this proves it." The words hit like a punch, stealing my breath, and I waited for my wife to say something, anything, to shut it down. But she just stood there, her hands clasped tight, her eyes on the floor like she was hoping it would swallow her whole. The silence was worse than the insult, a confirmation that she wasn't on my side, maybe hadn't been for a long time. I could feel the crowd's eyes on me, their murmurs starting up again, and for a moment, I wanted to drop everything, walk out, leave them to their party, their judgment, their world that had no place for me. But this was my restaurant, my home, and I wasn't going to let them chase me out. I took a breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Sam, get a mop," I said, my voice low but firm. "Noah, bring some club soda for the dress." They moved fast, relieved to have something to do, and I turned back to Miriam. "We'll cover the cleaning," I said, knowing it wouldn't matter. She wasn't mad about the dress, she was mad about me, about what I represented, a crack in their perfect family picture. Dorian stepped closer, his voice cold. "You should have stayed in your lane, Callan. This isn't your place anymore." I wanted to laugh, to tell him this was more my place than anywhere I'd ever been, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I just nodded, because arguing wouldn't change them. It never had. I was about to walk away, to retreat to the kitchen and let them have their moment, when the front door opened and a ripple went through the room. I didn't know who just walked in, but the way the crowd shifted, the way Miles's face lit up, told me it was someone important. I turned, expecting another one of his clients, another suit to fawn over him, but instead, I saw a man I'd met only once before, his silver hair catching the light as he scanned the room. My heart skipped, not sure why, and I felt the air change, like something big was about to happen. I didn't know it then, but that moment was the hinge everything would turn on, the crack that would split their world wide open. All I knew was that I was still standing, still here, and for the first time all night, I wasn't sure I was ready to walk away. I stood frozen in the dining room of the Heritage, the spilled wine still pooling at my feet. Miriam's venomous words, "My daughter married down," ringing in my ears like a bell that wouldn't stop. The party had gone quiet after her outburst, every guest staring, some pretending they weren't, while my wife stood silent, her eyes fixed on the floor instead of on me. I'd been ready to walk away, to slip back to the kitchen and let them have their moment, when the front door swung open and the air shifted, like a storm breaking. I turned, expecting another of Miles's fancy colleagues, but instead, I saw Lawrence Maddox, CEO of Maddox Capital, striding in, his silver hair catching the light, his presence commanding the room without a word. I knew him, not well, but enough, and my heart gave a quick thud, though I wasn't sure why. Miles practically tripped over himself, his smug grin stretching wider as he pushed through the crowd. "Mr. Maddox, welcome," he said, voice dripping with eagerness. I reserved our best table, but the man barely glanced at him, his eyes sweeping the room until they landed on me, and then he smiled, warm and real, like we were old friends. He walked straight over, ignoring Miles's outstretched hand, and I felt the weight of every stare in the place settle on us. "Well, if it isn't the man behind the heritage," he said, his voice carrying over the hum of the party. "Callan Ward, what a surprise." He reached out, his grip firm and steady as he shook my hand, and for a moment, I forgot the tray in my other hand, the uniform sticking to my back, the sting of everything that had just happened. The room seemed to hold its breath, and I could sense my wife's family watching, their faces shifting from scorn to something I couldn't quite read. "You know him?" Miles asked, his voice cracking just enough to betray his shock. The CEO laughed, a deep, easy sound that filled the space. "Know him? He catered my wedding anniversary last fall. Best meal I've had in 20 years. I blinked, caught off guard, because I remembered that night. His wife's laughter, his quiet nod of approval as I explained the menu, but I hadn't realized it meant anything to him. I managed to smile, my voice steady despite the chaos in my head. "Glad you enjoyed it, Mr. Maddox. Means a lot." He clapped me on the shoulder, still holding my hand like we were sealing a deal. "Enjoyed it? My guests are still talking about that short rib. You've got something special here, Callan. Don't let anyone tell you different." His words hit harder than they should have, landing square in the hollow space where my wife's family's insults had been piling up all night. I glanced at her, hoping for a flicker of pride, something to show she was still with me, but her face was pale, her lips parted like she'd just seen something she couldn't explain. Miriam and Dorian were frozen at their table, their usual smugness replaced by a kind of stunned silence, and for the first time all night, I felt like I could breathe. Miles tried to recover, stepping closer, his grin forced now. "Well, that's great to hear," he said, his eyes darting between us like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "I didn't realize you two had history." The CEO turned to him, his smile polite but cool, like he was sizing him up. "History? I'd say it's more like respect. Callan's got a gift, and this place proves it." He gestured around the dining room, the oak tables, the brass lights, the open kitchen humming with life, and I felt a warmth in my chest, a reminder of why I'd fought so hard for this. I'd spent years building the heritage, pouring everything into it, and to hear someone like him say it out loud, in front of the people who'd spent all night tearing me down, was like a lifeline I hadn't known I needed. I set the tray down on a nearby table, my hand steadier now, and nodded. "Appreciate that," I said, keeping it simple because I didn't trust myself to say more. My wife's brother was still hovering, trying to insert himself into the moment, but the man wasn't having it. He turned back to me, his voice dropping to a quieter tone. "You ever think about expanding? I know some folks who'd love to invest in a place like this." It wasn't the first time someone had asked, but coming from him, it felt different, real, not just polite chatter. I shrugged, my mind racing. "Maybe someday," I said. "For now, I'm just trying to keep the lights on." He laughed again, like he knew exactly what I meant, and for a moment, it was just us, two guys talking shop, no Ashfords, no judgment, no weight of their world pressing down. The crowd was starting to buzz again, the shock of his entrance wearing off, but I could still feel their eyes on me, Miriam's pinched frown, Dorian's stiff posture, my wife's silence louder than any words. I wanted to look at her, to see if this changed anything, but I kept my focus on the man in front of me, because right now, he was the only one in the room who saw me for who I was. "You're doing more than keeping the lights on," he said, his tone serious now. "This place has soul. That's rare." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, my throat tight with something I couldn't name. He glanced around, then back at me. "I'll let you get back to it. But we're having dinner here next month, my treat. You pick the menu." I smiled, a real one this time. "Deal." He gave my shoulder another pat and moved toward the table Miles had reserved, the crowd parting for him like water. I stood there, the tray forgotten, my heart pounding as the reality of what had just happened sank in. The Ashfords were watching me now, not with scorn but with something else, confusion, Maybe, or calculation. Miles's grin was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped stare, and I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, trying to figure out how I'd pulled this off. I didn't care. For the first time all night, I felt like I was standing on solid ground, like I'd been seen, not as a failure or a waiter, but as the man who'd built something worth noticing. I glanced at my wife again, hoping for a sign that she felt it too, but her eyes were on the CEO now, her hands twisting together like she was nervous. I wanted to believe it was pride, or even surprise, but the knot in my stomach told me it was something else, something I wasn't ready to face. I picked up the tray and started moving again, clearing glasses, nodding at guests, my mind replaying his words like a song I didn't want to end. The party was still alive, the laughter and chatter picking up, but it felt different now, like the air had shifted in my favor. I didn't know what would happen next, whether this would change anything with my wife's family or with her, but for now, I held on to that handshake, that moment when someone saw me for everything I'd fought to be. It wasn't much, maybe, but it was enough to keep me standing, enough to remind me why I'd chosen this life, even when it hurt. I stood near the edge of the Heritage's dining room, the weight of Lawrence Maddox's handshake still tingling in my palm, his words, "Best meal I've had in 20 years," echoing in my head like a drumbeat I didn't want to stop. The party was buzzing again, the shock of his arrival settling into a low hum of chatter and clinking glasses, but the air felt different now, charged with something I couldn't quite name. My wife's family, who'd spent all night cutting me down, were suddenly looking at me like I was a puzzle they hadn't solved. Miriam's face was tight, her usual sneer replaced by a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes, while Dorian leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, studying me like I'd just pulled a trick he hadn't seen coming. Miles was the worst, his grin had vanished, and he kept glancing between me and his boss, who was now seated at the best table, laughing with a guest like nothing had happened. I could feel my wife watching me too, her expression caught somewhere between surprise and something heavier, but I didn't meet her eyes. Not yet. I wasn't sure I could handle what I'd see there. I grabbed a tray of empty glasses and started moving through the crowd, my hands steady even as my mind raced. The room was alive with the smell of roasted garlic and fresh bread, the kind of comfort that usually grounded me, but tonight, it wasn't enough to shake the feeling that I'd just crossed a line I couldn't uncross. The CEO's words had flipped a switch, not just for me but for everyone here, and I could sense the shift in the way people looked at me, not as the guy in the server's uniform, but as someone who mattered, someone who'd earned a nod from a man like that. It felt good, better than I wanted to admit, but it also felt fragile, like a moment that could slip away if I didn't hold it tight. I set the tray down by the bar and wiped my hands, trying to focus on the rhythm of the night, clear plates, check tables, keep moving. But my wife's family wasn't done with me yet. Miriam was the first to make a move, standing up as I passed her table, her dress still stained from the spilled wine but her posture regal, like she was about to deliver a verdict. "Well, that was unexpected," she said, her voice syrupy, like she was trying to smooth over the venom she'd spat earlier. "We're so proud of what you've done here, Callan. We were just talking about it." I stopped, my hand halfway to a glass, and looked at her, waiting for the catch. She'd called me a disgrace 20 minutes ago, said her daughter deserved better, and now she was proud? I didn't buy it, but I nodded, keeping my face neutral. "Thanks," I said, because what else was there to say? Dorian chimed in, his tone gruff but careful, like he was testing the water. "Didn't know you had connections like that." Impressive. I could have laughed. Connections? I'd met the man once, cooked for him, that was it, but I just shrugged. "Just doing my job," I said, and turned to clear another table, hoping they'd let it drop. They didn't. Miles was next, sidling up as I stacked plates, his tie loosened now, his eyes glinting with something that wasn't quite friendly. "Hey, man, that was a hell of a moment," he said, his voice loud enough to draw attention. "You should have told us you knew Maddox. I could bring some big names in here, help you grow." He leaned closer, like we were buddies sharing a secret, and I caught a whiff of whiskey on his breath. "Maybe get you a VIP card or something, make this place a real hotspot." I set the plates down harder than I meant to, the clink cutting through his words. He was offering to help me now, after years of sneering, after laughing in my face when that wine hit his mother's dress. I wanted to tell him where he could shove his big names, but I bit it back, because this wasn't about him. It was about me, about what I'd built here, and I wasn't going to let him ruin it. My wife was watching from a few feet away, her hands twisting together, and I could tell she was waiting for me to say something, to play along with their sudden change of tune. Then she stepped forward, her voice soft but clear. Maybe you could give him a stake in the business, she said, looking at me like she was offering a gift. Just a little partnership, keep it in the family. I froze, the tray heavy in my hands, and for a second, I couldn't breathe. A partnership? With her brother, who'd spent all night mocking me, who'd never set foot in here unless it was to show off. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something I hadn't before, not just embarrassment or distance, but a kind of desperation, like she thought this was the way to fix everything, to make me fit into their world. That's when it hit me, sharp and clear, and I laughed, a loud, real laugh that burst out before I could stop it, echoing over the chatter. The sound stopped them cold. Miriam's smile faltered, Dorian's eyes narrowed, and Miles looked like I'd slapped him. My wife's face went pale, her lips parting, but I didn't care. I set the tray down and straightened up, feeling lighter than I had all night, like I'd finally shed something I'd been carrying too long. You're joking, right? I said, my voice steady, loud enough for the tables nearby to hear. You've spent years treating me like I'm nothing, and now, because one guy shakes my hand, you want a piece of what I built? I looked at each of them, letting the words sink in. I don't need your help. I never did. The room was quieter now, heads turning, but I wasn't done. I turned to my wife, my chest tight but my voice calm. And I don't need you to fix me. This place, this life, it's mine. If you can't see that, that's on you. I didn't wait for their response. I grabbed the tray and walked back to the kitchen, my heart pounding but my steps sure. The doors swung shut behind me, muffling the party's noise, and I leaned against the counter, the smell of thyme and butter wrapping around me like a shield. Noah glanced over from the grill, one eyebrow raised, but he didn't ask, just nodded like he knew I'd handled something big. I didn't know what would happen next, whether my wife would follow me, whether her family would double down or back off, but for the first time all night, I felt free. I'd spent years chasing their approval, trying to prove I was enough, and in one laugh, I'd let it all go. The heritage was mine, built with my hands, my heart, and no one, not even the woman I loved, could take that away. I wiped my hands on a towel and got back to work, because whatever came next, I was ready to face it on my terms. I stood behind the bar at the Heritage, wiping down the counter with a rag that didn't need to be moved, my heart still racing from the laugh I'd let out in front of my wife's family. The one that had silenced their fake smiles and left them staring like I'd grown a second head. The party was winding down now, the dining room half empty, the air heavy with the smell of coffee and leftover dessert. Lawrence Maddox was gone, his table cleared, but the echo of his handshake and his words, "You've got something special here," still hung around me, a shield against the Ashford's sudden shift from scorn to scheming. My wife was at her parents' table, her back to me, whispering something to Miriam, while Miles hovered near the door, checking his phone like he was waiting for a chance to rewrite the night. I'd said my piece out there, told them I didn't need their help or their approval, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was standing on my own ground. But the high was fading, and now I had to figure out what came next. I set the rag down and started stacking clean glasses, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind churned. My wife's suggestion, a partnership with her brother, kept replaying, each word a fresh cut. She looked at me like she was offering a lifeline, like handing over a piece of the heritage would somehow make me whole in their eyes. I wanted to believe she meant well, that she was just caught up in their world, but the truth was harder to swallow. She didn't see me anymore, not the way she used to, not the way I needed her to. I glanced at her again, her dark hair catching the light, and felt a pang in my chest, a mix of love and loss that made it hard to breathe. I'd built this place for us, for the life we dreamed of together, but somewhere along the way, she'd stopped dreaming with me. Now, she was sitting with the people who'd spent all night tearing me down, and I was here, alone, wondering if I'd been fighting for something that was already gone. The front door opened, letting in a gust of cool air, and I looked up to see Noah waving off a guest, his face tired but calm. He caught my eye and nodded toward the kitchen, a silent check-in, and I gave him a quick thumbs up, because what else could I do? I wasn't about to unload on him, not when we still had a room full of people to get through. But as I turned back to the bar, I saw Miles heading my way, his tie loose, his grin back in place like he hadn't just been schooled in front of his boss. I braced myself, knowing he wasn't done trying to claw his way into this moment. "Hey, man," he said, leaning on the counter, too close for comfort. "No hard feelings, right?" That was a big win out there with Maddox. "Let's talk business. Seriously, I could open doors for you." His voice was all charm, but his eyes were calculating, like he was already counting the profits he didn't deserve. I kept stacking glasses, my jaw tight. I said what I needed to say. I told him, not looking up. We're good. He didn't take the hint, just leaned closer, lowering his voice like we were in on something together. Come on, don't be like that. I'm just trying to help. Your family, right? That word, family, hit like a slap, and I stopped, my hand still, and looked at him. Family? He'd laughed when his mother called me a disgrace, stood by while they humiliated me in my own place, and now he was playing the brother card? I felt something snap, not loud or dramatic, but quiet, like a lock clicking shut. I straightened up, my voice low but clear. Let me make this straight. You mocked me for years, humiliated me tonight, right here at my own table, and now you want him because someone with a title shook my hand? That's not family. That's opportunism. His grin faltered, and I saw a flash of something, anger, maybe, or embarrassment, but I wasn't done. I pointed at the security monitor behind the register, its screen flickering with a grainy view of the dining room. If you, or anyone else, says another word about me or this place, I'll send the footage of what you said tonight to your boss. Every bit of it, your mother's rant, your little speech about me being a waiter in my own house. Let's see how much he values integrity in his senior staff. I didn't raise my voice, didn't need to. The words landed like stones, and I saw his face change, the color draining until he looked like he'd been caught stealing. He opened his mouth, then closed it, and for once, he didn't have a comeback. He backed off, muttering something about checking on his guests, and I watched him go, my pulse steady now, like I'd finally said what I'd been holding back for years. I turned back to the glasses, but my wife was there now, standing a few feet away, her hands clasped tight, her eyes wide like she'd just seen a stranger. You didn't have to do that, she said, her voice soft but sharp, like she was trying to keep it together. I waited for her to say more, to explain why she'd stood by while her family tore me apart, why she'd suggested giving her brother a piece of my soul, but she didn't. She just looked at me, waiting for me to back down, to smooth it over like I always did. I didn't. Yeah, I did, I said, my voice calm but final. I'm done letting you all walk over me. This is my place, my life. If you can't stand by that, we've got nothing left to say. Her lips parted, but no words came, and I saw something break in her eyes, something I couldn't fix, not tonight, maybe not ever. I walked away, back to the kitchen, the doors swinging shut behind me, muffling the last of the party's noise. Noah was there, plating the final desserts, and he didn't ask what happened, just handed me a coffee and kept working. I leaned against the counter, the warmth of the mug grounding me, and looked around at the chaos of my kitchen, the sizzling pans, the stacks of dishes, the life I'd built from nothing. My wife's family paid the bill in full, not a cent discounted, and I didn't care if they ever came back. I'd spent too long trying to fit into their world, hoping they'd see me, hoping she'd see me, but tonight, I'd drawn a line. The heritage was mine, and so was my peace. I didn't need their table, their approval, or their version of who I should be. I'd built my own, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could sit at it without apologizing. I sat in the quiet office at the back of the heritage, the party long over, the dining room empty except for the hum of the cleaning crew mopping the floors. My laptop was open, but I wasn't looking at the screen, just staring at the wall, my hands still, the weight of the night settling into my bones like a cold I couldn't shake. My wife's family was gone, their bill paid in full, their fake smiles and backhanded offers left behind like dirty plates I didn't want to touch. I'd stood up to them, laughed in their faces, threatened to send that security footage to Miles's boss if they pushed me again, and it felt good, sharp, clean, final. But now, in the silence, I wasn't so sure. My wife's eyes kept flashing in my mind, the way she looked at me when I'd shut her down, not just hurt but lost, like she didn't know who I was anymore. I'd drawn a line, but what if it had cut too deep? What if I'd burned something I couldn't rebuild? I leaned back in the chair, the leather creaking under me, and rubbed my face, trying to shake the fog. The office smelled faintly of coffee and old wood, a mix that always calmed me, but tonight it wasn't enough. My phone buzzed on the desk, and I glanced at it, a text from her, the first since everything went down. Mom's birthday next week. Everyone's hoping you'll come. I stared at the words, my thumb hovering over the screen, waiting for something to click, some feeling to tell me what to do. But all I felt was tired, like I'd been carrying her family's judgment for years and had only just set it down. I didn't want to go to that birthday, didn't want to sit at another table where I'd be measured and found wanting. I didn't want to pretend anymore, not for her parents, not for her brother, not even for her. I set the phone down without replying, because I didn't have an answer, not yet. I got up and walked to the window, looking out at the street, the Brooklyn night quiet except for a few passing cars. A week ago, I might have answered that text, might have gone to the birthday, brought a gift, smiled through their digs because that's what I did, kept the peace, kept her happy, kept hoping they'd change. But tonight had broken something, not just between me and them, but between me and the version of myself who'd thought I could win them over. I thought about Miriam's voice, calling me a disgrace, about Miles's laugh when he'd mocked me in my own place, about my wife's silence, louder than any insult. I thought about Lawrence Maddox's handshake, the way he'd seen what I'd built and called it special, and I realized that was enough, more than enough. I didn't need their approval, didn't need their table. I built my own, right here, and it was stronger than anything they could offer. I went back to the desk and opened a browser, not sure what I was looking for until I found it. A jewelry site, the kind my wife used to browse when we were younger, dreaming about the future. I scrolled until I saw a pearl set, $2,500, delicate and timeless, the kind of thing Miriam would wear and pretend she didn't care about. I added it to the cart, typed in her parents' address, and started writing a card in my head. Not a long one, just enough to say what I needed to say. "This is my last gift," I wrote. "I stopped being family when I stopped being useful to you." I read it over, my fingers hovering over the keys, and then hit send, the order confirmation popping up like a full stop at the end of a sentence. I didn't feel angry, didn't feel sad, just done, like I'd closed a door I'd been holding open too long. I grabbed my phone again and opened my contacts, scrolling through the names, my wife, her parents, her brother, all tied to a life I'd been trying to fit into for years. My thumb lingered over her name, her picture smiling back at me, a shot from a beach trip we'd taken before the Heritage, before things got complicated. I wanted to call her, to ask if she'd meant what she'd said about giving her brother a stake in my business, to ask if she still loved the man I'd become or just the one she'd wanted me to be. But I didn't. Instead, I blocked her number, then her parents', then Miles's, one by one, each tap like a weight lifting off my chest. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't loud, just a quiet choice to stop fighting for people who'd never fought for me. I set the phone down and leaned back, the office silent except for the faint clink of dishes being stacked outside. I stood up and walked out to the dining room, the lights dim now, the tables bare. Noah was gone, the crew wrapping up, and I was alone with the place I'd built. I ran my hand over a table, that would smooth under my fingers, and thought about the nights I'd spent here planning menus, balancing books, laughing with Jonas and Priya until dawn. This was my home, not just a restaurant, but a promise I'd made to myself, to live on my terms, to create something that mattered. I thought my wife was part of that promise, but maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe she'd never really signed on for the fight. I didn't hate her for it, didn't hate any of them, just saw it clear now, like a fog lifting. They wanted a version of me I'd left behind, and I couldn't go back, not even for her. I locked the front door and stepped outside, the night air cool against my face. The street was quiet, the neon sign above the restaurant flickering softly, and I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. I'd sent the pearls, blocked the numbers, drawn the line, not out of anger, but out of clarity. I didn't need their fights, their judgments, their world. I had this one, right here, built with my own hands, and it was enough. I started walking home, my steps light, the city humming around me like it was cheering me on. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe she'd show up, maybe she wouldn't. But for now, I was free, not just from them, but from the part of me that had kept trying to please them. The Heritage was waiting for me in the morning, same as always, and so was the life I'd chosen. I'd show up for it, like I always did, and that was all I needed to know. I stood in the dining room of the Heritage just before opening, the morning light filtering through the windows, casting long shadows across the polished oak tables I'd spent years choosing. The air smelled of fresh coffee and baking bread, a quiet promise of the day ahead, and I was alone, checking every detail, napkins folded, glasses spotless, menus stacked neat. It had been a week since the party, since I'd laughed in my wife's family's faces, sent that pearl set to her mother with a note that cut ties, and blocked their numbers without a second thought. The restaurant was my world now, more than ever, and I moved through it with a kind of calm I hadn't felt in years, like I'd finally shed a skin that never fit. I didn't feel cold or angry, just clear, like I could see my life for what it was, a table I'd built myself, one where I belonged without apologizing. I adjusted a chair, my fingers brushing the wood, and thought about the days since that night. My wife's family hadn't stayed quiet. They tried to reach me, not directly but through back channels, like I'd known they would. A friend of a friend stopped by the restaurant 2 days ago, all casual smiles, asking if I'd be at Miriam's birthday, dropping hints about how everyone missed me. I'd poured him a coffee, said I was busy, and changed the subject because I wasn't playing their game anymore. Then there were the messages on social media, vague posts from Miles about loyalty and family, probably fishing for attention, and a couple of DMs from my wife's cousins, acting like nothing had happened, asking for a reservation like I'd just hand them a table after everything. I didn't respond, didn't block them either, just let them sit, because I didn't owe them anything, not my time, not my anger, not a damn thing. I walked to the kitchen, checking the prep stations, the hum of the fridge a steady backdrop to my thoughts. Noah was already there, chopping onions with a focus that always grounded me, and he gave me a nod without breaking rhythm. "Big day?" he asked, not looking up. I shrugged, leaning against the counter. "Same as always," I said, but we both knew it wasn't true. The restaurant was busier than ever. Word had spread after the party, maybe because of Lawrence Maddox's handshake, maybe because people love a story about someone standing up for themselves. Reservations were booked out for weeks, and I'd caught a food critic sniffing around last night, scribbling notes like she was solving a mystery. It should have felt like a win, but all I could think about was the quiet, the absence of my wife's voice, her laugh, the way she used to slip in here after hours and steal a bite of whatever I was cooking. I didn't miss the fights or the judgment, but I missed her, or at least the version of her I'd loved, the one who'd believed in this place as much as I did. I grabbed a tray of dough from the fridge, kneading it slow, the rhythm pulling me back to center. People had opinions about what I'd done. Some said I was cold, cutting off her family like that, blocking her number without a word. Others said I'd finally found my spine, that I'd let them walk over me too long. Maybe both were true, but I didn't care much for the debate. I hadn't done it to prove a point or settle a score. I'd done it to survive, to protect the one thing I had left that was mine. The Heritage wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was my home, my proof that I could build something real, something that lasted, without bending to anyone's rules. I pressed the dough flat, shaping it with steady hands, and thought about the years I'd spent chasing their approval, trying to be the man they wanted, polished, predictable, safe. I'd hated that man, and so had she, even if she wouldn't admit it now. I set the dough aside and walked back to the dining room, my shoes clicking on the floor, every sound familiar, every corner a memory. I thought about the early days, Jonas crunching numbers on a busted laptop, Priya burning her first batch of curry, me scrubbing grease off the walls until my knuckles bled. We'd laughed through it, fought through it, built something that wasn't just a business but a life. I didn't need my wife's family to see that, didn't need their names or their money or their grudging respect. I didn't even need her, not the way I used to, because I learned to stand without her, to fill the space she'd left with the work I loved. I stopped at the front window, looking out at the street, the Brooklyn morning waking up slow, and felt a quiet pride settle in, not loud or flashy, but solid, like a stone I could carry. I turned back to the room, my eyes catching the security monitor by the register, the one I'd pointed to when I'd shut Miles down. I hadn't sent that footage to his boss, didn't need to, because the threat was enough, and I wasn't in the business of ruining people, not even people who'd tried to ruin me. I'd kept it, though, a small insurance policy, a reminder that I wasn't powerless anymore. I didn't want revenge, didn't want their apologies or their guilt. I just wanted to be left alone, to walk through my days without their voices in my head. I'd spent too long letting them define me, letting their doubts creep into my work, my marriage, my dreams. No more. I had this place, this life, and it was enough, more than enough. I grabbed a cloth and started wiping down the bar, the wood gleaming under my hands, and thought about what I'd say if anyone asked why I'd done it, why I'd walked away from her family, from her. I wouldn't explain, wouldn't justify, because it wasn't about them. It was about me, about choosing a life that felt true, even when it hurt. I'd built this table, not to prove anything to anyone, but to have a place where I could sit, where I could breathe, where I could be the man I'd always wanted to be. And if you've ever been laughed at, underestimated, erased by people who were supposed to lift you, I'd tell you this. You don't need their seat, their approval, their version of who you are. You can build your own table, just like I did, and it'll be stronger than anything they could ever offer. I finished the bar and stepped back, the dining room ready, the day waiting. Noah called out that the bread was done, and I smiled, because that's how it went here, small moments, steady work, a life that didn't need to shout to matter. I didn't know if my wife would come back, if she'd try to fix things or just fade into her family's world, but I wasn't waiting anymore. I had the heritage, had Jonas and Priya, had Noah and the crew, had every guest who walked through that door looking for a meal and a story. I had myself, and that was enough to keep going, to keep building, to keep choosing this life, one day at a time.